All right, everyone. So, why do I use, it's my microphone, right? Yep. I use a small basketball in training. So often in training, I'll use like a 28.5 size basketball. You'll say, well, why are you using that? You don't play with a 28.5 size basketball. And there's two reasons. Two, not two, that's three. Two reasons. One is I think it has a lot to do with interoception. So interoception is the ability to internalize things. If someone says, how does your finger feel? You start to think about your finger, and then you might be like, oh my gosh, my finger actually hurts. Interoception. You might think about like, you're breathing, and next thing you know, you're internally thinking about your breathing. You internalize thought. There's some cool research on it regarding injuries with tendons and stuff. Basically, what can happen is if you think about your injury, then you can make an injury kind of occur. And this is important because if you externalize something, they do this, by the way, with tendon issues. They might have a tendon that's totally fine and dandy, no pain. Well, there is pain, but no tissue damage that should be causing pain. Yet you have pain. There's higher motor structures, well, brain structures connected to the motor cortex associated with movement, but like you can call them neuroreceptors, nocioreceptors, pain receptors that associate a movement with pain. I'll get to this in a basketball and how it's related in a second. But basically is that if you have a happy, healthy knee, but you still think there's pain, there's like a learned brain area. And what they'll do is they'll have you do, let's say, knee extensions to a metronome, timing 1, 2, 3, 4, and you focus on that. You focus on external stimulus. You remove the internal interoception aspect. And so you start to re-educate that pathway without pain. It has a lot to do with like neurological gating, like a gate. And they think that basically the focusing on a stimulus gates the pathway of pain or the perceived pathway of pain. Same thing happens when you wear headphones and you run and you can put out more effort. The headphones actually block the nocioceptors, the pain receptors of fatigue and whatnot, so you can go harder, further, and longer. So, how does that affect a basketball? Good question. When you have a basketball and you change sizes of it and you're constantly changing sizes of it, if you constantly internalize the basketball, how your hands are, the grip of the ball, whatever, you'll notice deviations. So you're like, oh, I'm so perfect. I want to get my hands here every time and this spot every time. Without knowing it, you have been in your past internalizing a lot of movements. You might not even be totally aware of it. But when you change basketballs, it forces a change in the sensory pattern, right? Your perception. You're actually catching a ball. The size of the ball is different. The sensory profile of you holding that ball is different. You will realize if you are overly internalizing stuff and you'll be like, oh, my hands need to be here, my hands need to be there. So if you just get used to shooting with any type of basketball, a good basketball, a bad basketball, you're not thinking about it. Or you ever shoot with a bad basketball and all you do is think about that bad basketball, you've internalized it. A small adjustment in your movement profile, an adjustment in the sense that small environmental adjustment is the word I'm looking for, and your movement profile causes you to internalize your movement. You're so used to shooting with a certain basketball that when you use a different type of basketball, your body goes, ah, no, and you just starts to think about it the whole time. But if you get used to using different basketballs and different things that are imperfect, you no longer internalize the process, but you externalize it. So you're just focusing on the result, the shot. So that's one reason. Number two is that shooting a smaller basketball changes the radius or the moment arm in which a force vector is being applied to the ball. So the actual physics of the ball. Now what happens is you have to be more perfect. Imagine like you're shooting a really big or a normal size basketball or a big thing. If I have a circle, the circumference of a sphere, and I have a line of force application through which I'm trying to drive that ball in a direction. If I take the angle from the center point of that sphere to the finger which I'm applying it, like there's like a perfect angle of release. Then any small deviation, there's an angle of difference. So right, if I have 0.1 and 0.2, we're making a triangle here, friends. So if you have a perfect line from point A to the center, that's like the perfect force vector that you can apply to the ball and it would go in the straight path exactly where you want it to be. Any deviation from that causes the ball to move. Well, in a smaller ball, because the circumference is smaller, a smaller magnitude and deviation, like an inch, is amplified with a smaller ball than a big ball because the total circumference is smaller. So it's like when you hit a simple example is when you shank a golf ball, it goes really, really far to the right. Versus if you hit a beach ball, maybe you're not hitting it directly in the perfect line, but because the beach ball is so big, the angle of deviation is smaller because it's not amplified. The less nerdy way of saying that makes you be more precise, and it forces certain areas to work a little bit harder. So like if I'm shooting a ball, one of the things that comes up is like, because I have to be more precise, I have to be more precise in my hands, my catch, and the entire movement shot profile has to be refined. And I'll use a small ball and use a big ball, use a small ball, use a big ball, and you'll start to realize that the small ball stresses certain aspects more so than what the big ball stresses. And sometimes those stressors that the small ball stresses can actually really help amplify the success rate on the big ball. So you have to be super perfect with the small ball, and because you've been practicing to be super perfect on the small ball, then you go to the big ball and you have more bandwidth to make air because you've been so perfect on the small ball that your standard variation or your standard deviation in air is less now. So in the big ball, it's less amplified and you can really shoot it at a rate that is more accurate. People say, oh, is it going to mess up your shot? Is it going to mess up, your form and technique? Well, you're not only using that ball first and foremost. You might only use it, I use it like 25% of the time. But on top of that, you really think like if you gave Steph Curry a small basketball, a big basketball, a normal size basketball, will he still be able to outshoot the average person? Yes. So there is some translation between being able to shoot a big basketball and a small basketball. Well, there's probably some transfer, I should say, transfer from shooting a small basketball to a big basketball. So there is some cross-pollination between the two movements, that there isn't going to be some level of interference. Maybe it's actually positive gains. But there's a red flag. You shouldn't do this if you have a psychological issue with the small ball. And then you start to get frustrated with it and you start to get really angry about it. And then you think to yourself, oh my gosh, I'm using the small ball, screwing up my form, and it hyper internalizes the process. This is what happens when people have paralysis by analysis. You give them a small deviation in their norm, and then all of a sudden everything becomes a problem because they hyper internalize everything. That's a big no-no. So not everyone will like these deviations in training, because sometimes it can elicit a negative response, such as, oh, my shot's now like this and my hands are like this, and then when I go to the big ball I notice this and this and this, and you did more harm than good. So that's why I don't care personally. I think it's just the skill of shooting. I think of it not like you need to make every shot. I just think of the skill of developing a shot. So I find it to be a very positive stressor. I like challenges and things that make me miss. Not everyone does. That's why I use a small basketball in training. Fun fact. Turn this off.